Hi everyone, thanks for joining us in the PC Games Zen Theatre at WASD 2022. My name's Alex Evans. I'm editor of Wargaming, which is PC Games Zen's sort of sibling site covering tabletop games. We relaunched last year, and we're here running the tabletop games section over there and hosting this panel. Thanks for joining us. We're going to be talking about, as you can see on the screen, the kind of relationship between the tabletop game world and video games in both directions, really. It's a two-way street. We are honoured to be joined by Chris Birch, founder and CEO, or head producer, perhaps?
Creative officer, chief creative officer.
Yeah. And boss of Modifius, an august tabletop games creator in the UK, creator of the licensed Bethesda tabletop games, Elder Scrolls, Call to Arms, and Fallout, Wasteland Warfare, among many other successful conversions of video game properties to the tabletop, including most recently the Fallout official tabletop role-playing game. We also have with us a giant face of our colleague deep in the American South, Adam Bradford, CDO of Demiplane, an organization creating a new digital platform for TTRPGs and running numerous actual play series of TTRPGs as well, including the Children of Aate series, running it currently with Deborah Ann Wall as DM. Adam was also the founder of D&D Beyond, the digitization of Dungeons and Dragons. We were going to have with us as well Matt Hart, creative director of Steamforged Games, another company working in the UK to create tabletop versions of video game properties, but unfortunately he's got the COVIDs, so he couldn't join us today, unfortunately, but he sends his best regards. Do you guys want to say a couple of words to say hello? Or have if I said everything there is to say about you?
Well, I'm Chris Birch. I started Modifius 10 years ago with my wife in a basement flat, and we're now 60 people working across the world. Thanks to COVID, we got rid of the offices. And we make lots of role-playing games and miniature games and board games based on a variety of properties from across video games, film, TV. Yeah.
Sure do. Adam, anything more from Alabama, just to kind of give yourself a round of profile?
I feel like the Prime Minister in V for Vendetta right now.
Seems.
Am I not here? I'm here. I see me. Hello?
I can...
Hello?
Do sign language, Adam.
Adam, we can't hear you right now.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
Yeah, if we could have it in just semaphore, that would be great.
Gonna pantomime.
Let's. So we kick off with Chris while we're waiting for the sound to come up. I thought we'd start just by talking about the tabletop games that got you into it and made you want to do it as a career, to make a business out of it.
So I remember, I think I was about 7 or 8 years old, and I was a very shy kid, and my mum said to my brother, Nick, for God's sake, get Chris out of the house. And they took me to, him and his girlfriend Caroline took me to a friend's house, the Sylvesters, to play a game called Dungeons and Dragons. And I just thought we were going to go and play some board games, and didn't sound great fun. But then the next morning I was raving at school about killing loads of goblins. I died that night in a pit trap, even though they'd given me a suit of plate armor and gave me 3 saving throws. I was still dead. But the character, I called myself that name. I've used it every time you have to write your name in a video game. I always use Brandon Carter. Every time I make a sample character in a role-playing game, it's Brandon Carter in memory of that first death. So it was Dungeons and Dragons, and then my mum would take us to her sister who had a cattery, and I was allergic to cats. So it was like going, hey, fancy going and having flu for the weekend? Great. And we went to a little knitting shop, which sounded brilliant fun. But I discovered at the back of this knitting shop a rack of Steve Jackson metagames, which were these little Ziploc bagged fantasy and science fiction hex games that were about £3 at the time. and one was called Ogre, which is all about this giant cybernetic massive tank rolling across a wasteland, and you've got loads of other little tanks to try and destroy it. And that kind of blew my mind, figuring out the maths of the rules and learning how to play. So that was it.
Some relatable bits there, like the back of shops with weirdly packaged tabletop games that was still significantly more exciting than the wool.
Yeah.
Have we got you back, Adam?
I think so.
Yeah. Wonderful news.
Welcome.
It's good to be here.
Same question. So, what was your childhood journey into tabletop games and how it took you to where you are right now?
Yeah, so first of all, I'm just going to say that I feel like the Prime Minister in V for Vendetta right now, because I'm a giant face somewhere, right? I can't see my giant face, but yes, okay. All right, excellent. I don't get as cool of a title as CCO either. CPO is way less cool than Chief Creative Officer. I don't even know what the D stands for. But when I was a kid, really my first introduction to what I would later recognize as tabletop games was the Saturday morning cartoon with Dungeons and Dragons. And so at the time, I wanted to get on that roller coaster and go to a faraway land. I grew up here in Huntsville, Alabama, and so this is a very authentic Southern accent, but this is also the Bible Belt, and so as you can imagine, in the early 80s, there was the Satanic Panic going on. And so many of the people who, were around me at the time, there is no way in the world that I could have played something like Dungeons and Dragons. It was not going to be anywhere around me, but watched that cartoon, fell in love with it, and I didn't even realize it at the time, but I would go back to class and I would have graph paper out during the remediation period, and I would be essentially playing one of these games without realizing that's what was going on. We weren't rolling dice, but we were saying, hey, pick a number between 1 and 100. And, if you're close enough, you're going to succeed on what you're doing. So we were kind of making our own tabletop games in those days. But when I was maybe 13, we had a very brave person, it actually through, ironically, the church where we were attending at the time, that said, hey, I think you're going to really, really love this game, because he knew we were all Star Wars fans. And so we gathered over at his house. It was almost like a secret, forbidden thing. So we went over there, and he pulled out the fantastic West End Games D6 version of Star Wars, and so we started playing the Star Wars role-playing game at the time, and I just remember just fistfuls of D6 dice and 14 D6 on my blaster rifle, and just dropping that down on the table. But yeah, so we played Star Wars because for whatever reason, it was in the Bible Belt, and with that Satanic Panic going on, it was okay to use the mystical energy field known as the Force, but magic was something that was a little more off limits. And so we played the Star Wars games version of that for a couple of years, and it wasn't long before just wanted more. And so the first time that I played Dungeons and Dragons, a year or two later, we played Dragonlance in 2nd edition, and I remember the moment where I knew that there was nothing else that I would be able to do with the rest of my life was rolling up first Dungeons and Dragons character, and the Dungeon Master was making us use stats all the way just straight down. So we were doing the method where whatever you rolled, the scores. And so I rolled an 18 for strength with my first roll, and then I nailed the 00. So super, super rare to do. And so I liken it to, playing golf for the first hole in one and then chasing that high for the rest of your life and never been able to do it again. But yeah, so loved that Paladin Knight of the Rose character that I played in Dragonlance, and it was over with for me at that point. I did it all the time.
I think we can all relate to, if you've played D&D more than once, like the moment of getting to know your first character is a significant one. I'm really interested in the role that you're both playing in the tabletop game industry right now. It's common knowledge that even since before the lockdown, but supercharged by the lockdown, surprisingly to some, tabletop games are in a boom right now. Like if you look at, I'm going to say the word, Games Workshop shares as a bellwether of the industry as a whole. They've gone mental, but so have smaller and up-and-coming organisations. Modifius, for one, has been much more successful, I think, in the last few years, and taken an upward turn. What's your experience of said boom in the last few years? What have you experienced of it? When did it start for you, and how long do you think it might continue?
I think the boom really started with Kickstarter because suddenly, I mean, us included, we launched with Kickstarter and raised $250,000 for our first project, and lots of people were just coming out of nowhere, with some relevant experience and putting together a Kickstarter and getting anywhere from 10 grand to hundreds of thousands, and that has pumped so much money into the industry, into the people that work in the industry, into freelancers, into creating new product. We were the first. I think color Call of Cthulhu books for Axel and Cthulhu, the first books we made. And you saw this step change in quality because now you could raise enough money to make a color book, a hardback book, have loads of beautiful art. When before Kickstarter, really, you had D&D, you had Pathfinder, and then everyone else was just getting by, doing whatever they could to get a book out, and often that meant it was just pages of white text, which is what I hated about it. I remember I was a club promoter doing rave parties from 9 at night till 9 in the morning, and big dodgy parties in the middle of the countryside, and so I wasn't gaming for like the best part of my 20s, and I came back and I was like, they still look the same, nothing's changed. And that's when I started it was why I was determined. It's got to be colour, it's got to look amazing, it's got to blow people away. And so Kickstarter has just, and also there's a lot more money has come in from Kickstarter that didn't exist in the industry before that. So clearly, they reached a lot of new people, but people were suddenly like, now I will spend my money on this. So all the people in the industry who were fans were suddenly finding stuff that they couldn't resist to buy. And so that has created this surge. And of course, Kickstarter just grows and grows and grows. And I still meet people who don't know what Kickstarter is, or who are gamers who've never backed something on Kickstarter. So that, and there's countries where they haven't launched yet. So that's just going to keep going. And of course, COVID had that big surge. PDF sales went nuts. Miniatures went nuts because suddenly everyone was painting their pile of shame, and even though they couldn't maybe play, they were still being able to take part in the hobby, and so that's just, it's been this just an injection of adrenaline into something that was already growing really fast.
It's certainly been our experience. Just we cover the news of the industry and just the number of games coming out on Kickstarter, and of course GameFound and the kind of other crowdfunding sites set up just for our industry. It's happening very quickly. What's your experience of the same sort of thing, Adam?
Quickly hides his pile of shame of miniatures that are not painted yet. And I can't let it go without saying something about the first time that I met Chris, and he mentioned rave parties. I might not even be using the right term there, but I was utterly fascinated, and I think we need a panel follow-up with him talking about that experience. But
yeah, that's 9:30 tonight.
Okay, excellent. I didn't know it was on the schedule. But ultimately, crowdfunding, I won't cover that part because Chris has covered it really well here, but crowdfunding has absolutely had a massive impact on the growth of the industry. But the other element that I would mention is streaming. And so in my former life, founded D&D Beyond, and one of the incredible things about that was having access to just enormous amounts of data on a scale that few in the tabletop industry have been able to have before. And as you're able to start parsing some of that data, I can't get into all the secrets about it, But one of the things that we know with a great deal of certainty at this point is that streaming is the number one reason that new players are coming to these games at this point in time. And so, of course, we can't say we cannot say enough about the impact that groups like Critical Role have had on the industry. But the story that we always hear is, if you are going to learn to play baseball, do you give someone a baseball rule book? And I don't know if you've ever seen a baseball rule book, but there's no way that you could actually read what is in that rule book and get from the page to out there hitting balls and running bases. It would never happen. But if you're going to teach somebody to play baseball, you're going to take them to a game, and you're going to let them see people playing baseball in this case. And so that's what streaming has done for the tabletop space. It's allowed people to just, instead of the only way before we were able to learn is we had a family member or a friend that knew, and they took us under their wing and showed us how to do it, or we wandered into a game store and we somehow found the deep dark basement where people were playing, and we watched for a little while. Streaming has made that more accessible than ever, and over half of the new people coming to the game will cite streaming as the reason that they're coming into it. So I think crowdfunding for publishers has had an enormous impact and has allowed publishers that aren't the big 2 or 3 out there trying to do things to be able to, as Chris was saying, just incredible products. The artwork in Motivia's products, Free League products, so many of these publishers, the production value is massive today, and crowdfunding has so much to do with that. But I think that when you look at the user acquisition and fans coming into the hobby and into the industry, streaming has had an enormous impact as well.
Absolutely. I think that kind of brings us quite naturally into, this panel is looking at the two-way street between tabletop and video games, or rather tabletop and digital gaming, I should say. And Adam, your brainchild, D&D Beyond, is a big part of that. That transition that's happening for D&D and for other TTRPGs. So I was going to ask, in parallel to what's happening with TTRPGs with that, we've also got a resurgence of what was computer RPG, the CRPG genre is coming back. Larian Studios has been hugely successful with its games in the last 5 years, which are essentially, creating a D&D-like world, a TTRPG-like world, a TTRPG-like game experience, but with beautiful graphics. These are all examples of tabletop games making the trip back into digital. What's your experience of that, Adam, and how do you think that some of those examples are changing the way that we play tabletop games?
Yeah, it's a really big question, and I want to make sure that Chris gets to talk. So I'm going to try to be as brief as I can here. But I think that the evolution of that and how that has come up over the years, the word that keeps coming to mind for me is just really natural and organic, because I think that as we play tabletop games, especially tabletop role-playing games, what connects us to that, I think, as human beings, what's a primal need for humans is storytelling. And that storytelling is something that we're going to find a way to scratch that itch. And I just happen to believe that tabletop role-playing games are, one of the best and most accessible ways that we can scratch that storytelling itch. And so I think it was a very natural evolution from the time of, the NES days. And I remember sitting down and playing, the very first Legend of Zelda. And, when you come back and play that today, if you really try to divorce yourself from the nostalgia, there's not a lot going on in that game. But the thing that was happening was it was giving you a framework for your mind and your imagination to be able to fill in the blanks there. And so I think as video game technology has just advanced so much in the last few decades, we are seeing a moment now, especially, and of course it was a sweet spot with Baldur's Gate and Planescape Torment, and all these games coming out in this real golden age of tabletop RPGs being translated into computer RPGs. I think today we are seeing this new resurgence because now people who have been playing both tabletop RPGs and some of these computer RPGs as they've been coming up and growing up, they are now wanting more out of that. And so one of the things that's happening is it's not enough to just play through someone else's campaign that the folks at Larian, for instance, have written. They want tools to start being able to tell their own stories. They want to be able to game master and jump in there like that. And so I think that we are on the kind of the steps leading into the front door of what's going to be another big push in this space. And I think that the thing that we're going to see is there are going to be more and more tools that are going to let people tell their own stories and have more flexibility in how that goes, instead of being completely on the rails like it has happened through the years here. But yeah, I think that I think that there is so much to be learned from the tabletop to the video gaming side of that. And I know that this is probably later questions, so I won't get into it too much right now. And then, coming back from that, there's so much that can be learned. And I think both video games and the tabletop RPGs benefit greatly from that.
Sure. Do you have anything to add on that before we go on the other direction, Chris?
I think you covered it. Very good.
Well, he set you up perfectly, I guess.
Yeah.
The idea, I guess, is that games like Larian games and those kinds of things are perfect recruiting grounds as well for people who've grown up with video games and perhaps haven't yet been exposed in the way that teens in the 90s and 80s and 90s and noughties might have been to tabletop games. So they might play a game like that and then think, hang on, what's this based on?
Yeah.
And then come into our world. Is that something that you think is a mechanism you're seeing?
I think... you obviously, both worlds are very similar. If you're a video gamer, you've probably been exposed to a lot of geek culture, whether it's tabletop games, role-playing games, board games. So there's a lot of crossover. You go into most big, sci-fi, geek sites, you're going to see articles like, about tabletop gaming, this has been licensed to create a game, or this has become a game, or this is becoming a movie. So it's all very close now. So I think if you're interested, it's quite easy to see that. And your friends, there'll be someone who's a D&D player or a board gamer who will introduce you. So I think it's a lot closer now, and it's a lot easier to see that information. Like when I was growing up, there was no internet. So it was literally, we were completely reliant on walking into a gaming shop, as I did. Well, it wasn't a gaming shop, it was a knitting shop. But or someone showing you a game. So, I think that's kind of probably the strongest part of it, and of course now you've got so many tabletop companies, pimping themselves out there in all the media.
It's just the vivology there. And obviously many of the titles, many of the games that Modiphius makes are licensed from, as Adam was saying, storytelling is a thread that links all of these types of games. There are RPGs tend to be really driven by your experience of the story. Many of your games are based on, really story-heavy, rich RPG worlds that people have loved in video games, like the Elder Scrolls and the Fallout. This is a successful area. Like, many companies are trying to do what you do and convert these video game properties into successful tabletop games. What are the pitfalls of that? Like, what makes a successful adaptation?
Well, it takes a long time. Star Trek, that's a good example. Actually, no, sorry, let's talk about video games. So Elder Scrolls Fallout. I knew the people at Bethesda from when I had a t-shirt company. I was had a company called Joystick Junkies that was video games, cool, arty clothing. And I was talking to Bethesda about doing some clothing back then. And when I'd started Modiphius, I think 2 or 3 years in, I was like, oh yeah, I should talk to Bethesda. And reached out to this contact, got introduced to someone else, and every 6 months I'd prod them going, hey, any chance we could talk about this? Didn't hear back, an occasional email that acknowledged we existed, but that was it. It took about 3 years before that person changed, new person came in, hey, can we do something? And then I remember finally getting a phone call, and I was walking through Hyde Park with my wife just on a day out, and they rang me. I was like, oh, so what are you interested in? I was like, I don't know, Fallout, Warhammer. And they were like, yeah, sure, sounds great. Let's get a proposal together. But then that took quite a long time, and because they're busy, and for them, a big video games company, this is part of the problem, is they're making hundreds of millions, and you're offering very small fractions of that as potential revenue. And it's a huge amount of work, because a war game or a role-playing game is 200-300 pages of a book. Someone's got to read it. And that someone, usually they don't have big licensing teams like the film companies. It's someone in the team, like the art director, has got to read the book, and they're busy making the game. And a lot of the video games companies don't want them being distracted, because this has a huge impact on their schedule. So, we had to take our time, and eventually, after about 5 years of talking, we got a deal. I remember getting the contract, and like, oh my God, we did it. And then, we proved what we could do. We gave them these beautiful miniatures. We showed that we knew the property. And, and it's very tough at the beginning. It's very strict. You've just got to make sure everyone working on the project absolutely loves it, and everything you deliver is perfect. And then after a while, they were just approving everything. All the miniatures went through. I mean, I think we've probably given them 700-800 miniatures now across Elder Scrolls and Fallout, and we've probably had 5 with comments, and one because the character was based on his wife, and he's like, no, you need to change this, please. And but otherwise, it's been great, and we've just won their trust, and apparently Todd Howard's got a whole set of the miniatures painted on his shelf now, and so but it's really, really hard work. But you're getting access to a global brand, so you're getting access to millions of fans, to all this imagery, all this world. So we don't have to go off and create something new. We don't have to create. I mean, we are creating some new IPs now because I want to own some more. But being able to walk into a license like Star Trek and Elder Scrolls and James Bond, all the stuff we picked up, gets you a big property with a huge audience that when you go, hey, Alex, we're making a game about Elder Scrolls, you go, fantastic. Yeah. I want to write about that. So it's really easy to get coverage. Whereas I go, hey, I've made a game about unicorns with rocket launchers. You might be a bit less dubious, a bit more dubious about that. So you're getting this enormous sort of marketing muscle and reach and content. But there's just enormous amounts of work, and you've got to pay a lot of money to get that. You have to do this big forecast where you've got to work out what are you going to make over 3 years, and probably give them of their share. You're going to have to give them about half of that up front. So you've got to have a lot of cash in the bank and know that you're making. It's a risk, But again, Elder Scrolls, Fallout. If you can't get that right, then might as well go home.
Yeah, for sure. We've got a couple more minutes left before we need to go to questions. I wanted to ask you both, just briefly, a more kind of open question. Loads of people are creating tabletop games that are either inspired from or actually within the universes of, or increasing numbers of people making games that are inspired by, or in the universes of video games. In the same way, people like Demi Plain and others are, pioneering new ways to take tabletop games online or connect tabletop gamers together digitally. What does the future look like for that overlap in the next 5 years? What are the big trends to watch out for? Either of you can start, tic-tac-toe.
Do you want to kick it off?
Yeah, I can jump in. So I think that the big trends that are going to happen, especially in the tabletop space, is as it has gone from tabletop into video games are kind of as Chris was talking about there, a multi-billion-dollar industry at this point that is factors larger than the multi-billion-dollar film industry, for instance. So, video games are just such a massive part of life at this stage that, and they're incredible. Like, Elden Ring and some of these great games that are coming out right now, that my kids especially, it's hard to get them to do anything else than that right now. So I think video games are here to stay. But the thing that I think, again, the data, especially with what has unfortunately happened with this pandemic, people are starting to gravitate towards activities that put them back into a place where they are connecting with other humans. And sometimes that is going to be online through video conferencing software. Sometimes that's going to be able to be face to face. But instead of connecting at the level of yelling at them anonymously through your TV because they just killed you in Halo Infinite, or whatever that looks like, people want that human connection. And so as that human connection is happening, as things like streaming are making it so much easier to come to tabletop role-playing games, and then public crowdfunding is making it where publishers can create these incredible products that people can play. As that really starts to come together, I think the next thing that we're going to see is, just like video games, some of the greatest games that we know of at this point, they really were inspired and sparked by what was happening in the tabletop space. I think that tabletop games are going to start to learn so much from video games, and so it's going to kind of start going that direction. And even with D&D Beyond, when started that, so much of what we discussed back then, and then what I'm doing at Demiplane right now, where we are digitizing content for these games and trying to make it more accessible than ever. The thing that has always been at the fore of my mind is taking the best parts of video games and taking those best parts and applying them to tabletop RPGs. And so for a tabletop RPG, I think it's very important that it doesn't turn into a video game, because if we are trying to have it be a video game, then we'll just go play Skyrim instead of sitting down and playing the Elder Scrolls role-playing game. But I think that it is important to say, hey, video games handle this thing really, really well, or this other thing really well. We can learn things from that. We can start to incorporate that into this tabletop RPG experience and streamline it, make it easier, make it more accessible. And so I think that that's the thing that we're going to continue to see over the next 5 to 10 years, more and more convenience like that, more and more discoverability, being able to find people to play with, because I think that, that's one of the key things that video games currently have over tabletop RPGs, is if I want to play with someone on a video game, so much infrastructure's in place for LFG kind of functionality, all of those things. It's easy to go find someone to play with. With tabletop RPGs, that's a much harder proposition. And so I think that we can learn what those great things are about video games that are applicable to the space. And I think that's what we're going to continue to see more and more of over the next 5 years.
Absolutely. And Chris?
I think for me, I think accessibility is the big thing. So as Adam said, I think we as a company can now hire people all over the world because we don't need them to be in one office, and that being able to play with anyone around the world, and those tools, more and more easy to use tools sort of appearing in the market. But also, I think learning from video games. Video games now, gone is the day of having a little book in the CD, and no one ever read it anyway. But very intuitive tutorials that just let you get into the action, and it gets you playing in a really simple way. And for us, traditionally role-playing games, when I came back to it and discovered the books of white text, now we've got big books of colored text and lots of beautiful art, but there's still big books. And there's more and more, quick starts and quick to play guides. But I still think we struggle with the fact that you still got to read a 32-page booklet to get playing. And for me, in all our new releases, I'm really pushing for, I want you to start playing the moment you open the box. Not like, guys, I need to read this chapter for 30 minutes. Like, literally, start reading this, hand these out, start playing, you're in the Steam. And I think for me, removing as many barriers to entry for people to actually play a role-playing game is the big thing. I mean, I come from I was a kid in the late 70s when D&D was this really simple thing that everyone, it wasn't there was not a scene of gamers then. This was just average people. My brother was never a gamer. Him and his girlfriend just played because it was the cool thing to do. And it was so easy to teach people D&D back then. And we've made games complex because we like selling lots of books. And people want lots of cool books. They want lots of new content. And I want 20 books in this series that teach me all about the world. And that's fine. But at least you've got to have this simple introduction. And I think over the next couple of years, we'll see more and more products. And this is not just role-playing games. This is war games that just open the box, play. Just get rid of that barrier to entry.
As a reviewer of tabletop games, I couldn't agree more. I lost count of the number of reviews where we've had to say, minis are fantastic, gameplay is wonderful, but I had to spend quite a long time looking for the instructions to build the minis that weren't there.
Yeah.
Or looking for the rules that weren't there. Or looking for, it's... a lot of tabletop companies need to take those lessons from the video game industry and kind of market to a wider audience and be more accessible.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, guys. We've got about 10 minutes left for questions. The way this works is, if you have a question, stick your hand up, I will pick you, and then you need to go and stand next to that microphone and ask it, because we are streaming the session, so you need to be by the microphone to ask a question. Hello, you were first. It was the chair.
Hi, guys. You mentioned about playing board games. You need that human element. You need to meet up with your friends. And during this pandemic, I got quite into board games. I've collected quite a few now, to my wallet's dismay. But I've found, even though I've collected these games, because of the pandemic, I've not been able to play them with friends. And the way we got around that was on things like Board Game Simulator on Steam. So I was just wondering what's your guys' opinions on, if you can't meet up with friends to play a board game, playing a modded version of the game online with friends?
Well, yeah, we've been using Tabletop Simulator and Tabletopia. I mean, our team used to get around tables and cut bits of paper up and prototype, and we've been using that to develop all our games. But actually, when we launched our Skyrim board game, we created a free Tabletop Simulator version of the first of the 2 campaigns for the Skyrim board game. So anyone could just go and play it online, and because the COVID was still in full force last autumn, and it was great. And also it was brilliant for me because I could because we couldn't get the prototypes made up in the factory in time, so I could go to big streamers and go, hey Julie, do you want to, I'll come online and we can play Skyrim on your stream together, and I'll show you how to play the game and talk about it and talk about the design of the game. And people at home can go and download it for free. So I think it's been amazingly useful, and I've been playing a lot more streamed games or just online games with friends using the software. It's nothing like getting it on the table in front of you, but it beats not playing games at all.
There's a slogan. What about you, Adam? I think you might have something to say on this.
Yeah, I think that, a little more with tabletop RPGs than board games, but many of the principles are very applicable with me. But, I do think that what Chris is saying is true, that when I am playing in person with people around a table, there is a magic and an energy that isn't as translatable to being able to play this online. And even, part of my literal mission in life right now is doing whatever we can at Demiplane to try to figure out how to make that part of the process of being able to play online as transparent as it possibly can be, where as much of that magic and energy can come through as it can, and trying to minimize those negative impacts of the distance, the negative impacts of not being able to, perceive the body language as closely, all of those things. And it's not an easy challenge by any means. But the thing that I can say, and I think that many of us have encountered this, and it sounds like you did as well. This pandemic has, necessity is the mother of invention. And so I think that when we got into a place where we had to either not play these games or play them and use the tools that were available to us to play them, I think it has really uncovered a great deal of opportunity and a great deal of learning for people who are in technology like I am, to try to figure out where those pain points are to, again, it's our mission. I think about it way too much. I probably should work less on it, but just trying to figure out ways to make that part of the process as seamless as possible. Tabletop Simulator and other tools out there are off to a really great starting point, but there's a lot more ground for us to cover, and that's the challenge that's ahead of us.
Well, there's another trend for the future for you there.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Anyone else? Hello, yes.
First of all, thanks. This is super interesting, seeing the crossover between video games and tabletop role-playing games. Chris, you mentioned I've lost the word. Relationship with Bethesda was initiated by you. Have you heard much about it going the other way, where video game companies are reaching out to tabletop companies to create these games, or is it more the other way around?
It doesn't happen a lot because more financially, it makes more sense. They've got huge creative teams that they can create any IP and make more money, and why would they want to pay a cut? So we did license Act and Cthulhu as a tactics game, so you can download it you've got it on Steam and Xbox and PlayStation Store and Switch. And it's a turn-based XCOM style game. So I knew the publisher, the small developer. They came to us, and because we had all the content, and they wanted us to work with them on a Kickstarter, so we helped them with that. And it was a low-budget, small product, and that's quite unusual, really. I mean, it's occasionally, Chaosium licensed a game. They also did it with this company, Auroch Digital, but it's rare unless it's Dungeons and Dragons, where it's a big enough IP that now it's worth the video games company investing in someone else's IP, because really they want big movies that they can turn into a video game, and it's very rare that a tabletop company has got the size of an IP that really makes it worthwhile then giving up a share. So, Adam, I don't know if you've got anything.
Yeah. The thing that I will add to that is completely plus oneing everything that you just said. And I would say that licensors out there and studios are going to be looking much more toward the film and entertainment space than they would, into the tabletop space. But, at the end of the day, I think it comes down to whether those studios feel like they have that expertise in-house or not. And so I have had a couple of scenarios in the past life where some of the companies, especially some of the smaller ones, as Chris is talking about here, will approach in that former life. Gamepedia was a part of what I did for the job, and so Gamepedia was this great place for discovery. So you would have a lot of really great indie developers that, as we had started D&D Beyond, they started saying, hey, our game would be really, really great as a tabletop role-playing game. We're huge fans. Can we talk about that? So I saw some approaching there, but they certainly were not, AAA studios or anything like that, because Chris is hitting that nail on the head. And so I think that you're going to see a lot more of the bigger studios, we'll say studios instead of publisher there, you're going to see them come to the tabletop side and say, hey, we would like a tabletop game of our property, if they are film, if they're television, because I think that those kinds of places realize that there's such a gap between what they do and what we do in a tabletop RPG space, that they recognize that they don't have the expertise to pull it off. But if you're talking about a Bethesda or studios that make these games and do these kinds of stories already, absolutely, it seems like something that they would want to do internally typically. And I think it is going to take a really, really strong tabletop RPG publisher to convince them otherwise. And you've got an example of that sitting in front of you right there with Chris.
Actually, I was going to add, you do tend to see it more licensing into TV. I mean, Tales from the Loop was a TV series, obviously didn't come from the board game or the role-playing game, it came from the book. But it's a good example of television licensing a great property that really stood out, and it happened to have been also created as a role-playing game at a similar time. And I think you tend to see more TV involvement because they're looking for unique stories. And television companies don't tend to have creative teams. They go out and look for someone who's got a great idea. And the other problem is that tabletop companies don't really create their stories thinking about a transmedia property. They go, oh, wouldn't it be great to have a universe where there's like dragons, but machine guns as well, or dragons with steampunk, soldiers on steampunk horses. But what they need to be doing more of is building an actual property, a storyline that, you care about Marvel and the Avengers because of the Avengers, because of Tony Stark and his relationship with everyone else, You care about the characters, and role-playing companies don't tend to build their worlds thinking like that, thinking as a novel and a movie and a story that might develop. They tend to create a play space that you could play in as any character, whereas film and video games are looking for really strong, characterful storylines, and that's something that tabletop companies need to learn to develop that more when they create the worlds.
Is that a challenge you found, especially in the Fallout RPG, creating that play space where the heroes will be made by the players, where in the video games, of course, the story's laid out for you?
Well, I mean, the good thing with, like a Fallout or Elder Scrolls, you create a character from the beginning. Obviously, with our games, with the miniature games, is, okay, but now we've got multiple characters. And so what we always try and do, something kind of alluded to in the previous question, was, how do you do something that's different? There's no point recreating the video game, because we might as well go and play the video game. Whereas I was like, well, for Fallout, I want to have a whole crew. I want a whole bunch of characters. And yes, I might want Nora and my version of Nora with a laser rifle or whatever. But I also want these other characters and to see this whole story unfolding of them as a whole crew building up. Because I can't do that in the video game. I can't have a whole companion crew in Elder Scrolls. It's just me, unless you've got any of the mods. That lets you bring a couple of characters with you. So you always want to try and do something a bit different.
Absolutely. Thank you. Sorry, I stole your question. I think we've got time for one more. If anybody's got a question up the sleeve. No? Okay, well, we'll call it there. Please join me in a brief round of applause for our two panelists, Chris Birch from Odysseus and Adam Bradford at Demiplane. Thanks for joining us. Thanks so much for joining us. There's loads more talks and panels coming on in the PC Games End Theatre for the rest of the show. Come and join us in the Wargamer tabletop and chill out zone over the way. We've got loads of board games, tabletop games to play, to look at, to walk away with. If you've got money to pay for them, they're not free. Have a good time, and thanks for joining us. And thanks again.
Thanks.